Finney playfully criticizes Jean's clothes and grumbles about the lack of maid service. Jean responds that it is no great loss, considering the war, and he makes up Finney's bed for him. The next day, Brinker bursts in, about to ask if Jean is ready to enlist, when he sees Finney. He starts to make a joke about Jean's plan to kill Finney and get the room for himself, but Jean cuts him off and explains to Finney about Brinker's suggestion to enlist. Finney's unenthusiastic reaction leads Jean to realize that Finney doesn't want him to leave. Jean now tells Brinker, to Finney's obvious relief, that he no longer wants to enlist. The roommates begin to make jokes, saying that they wouldn't enlist with Brinker if he were General MacArthur's son or even Madame Chiang Kai-shek of China. In the midst of these jokes, Finney tags Brinker with a nickname, Yellow Peril Hadley, referring to his supposed double life as Madame Chiang Kai-shek. As Jean and Finney make their way over patches of ice to their first class, Finney remarks that Winter loves him. He knows this, he says, because he loves Winter, and it must return his affection. He then suggests that they cut class to give Finney a chance to look at the school after his long absence. They set out immediately across campus for the gym. Jean worries that Finney is planning to stare at his trophies and brood, but instead they go down to the locker room and Finney asks Jean what team he has joined for the year. Jean tells him that he did not try out for any teams, attempting to defend himself by noting the diminished importance of sports during the war. Finney declares that there is no war, that it is all a conspiracy orchestrated by the adult establishment by fat, rich, old men to keep young people in their place. When Jean asks why the conspiracy has not been detected by anyone else, Finney replies that he alone can see it because of the extent of his suffering. His answer amazes both boys. An awkward silence follows, and Jean, wanting to break the tension, goes over to an exercise bar and begins doing chin-ups. Finney tells him to do 30 and encourages him with his tone of voice as he counts them aloud for Jean. Finney tells Jean that he wanted to be an Olympic athlete and that now he will have to train Jean to go in his place. Finney convinces Jean to undertake the training despite his objections that the war will preempt the Olympics in 1944. Finney begins to train Jean and Jean tutors Finney in his classes. They are both surprised by their progress. One morning, as Jean runs a course around the headmaster's house under Finney's guidance, he suddenly finds his stride, running better than he ever has before. Mr. Lidsberry comes out to see what the boys are doing, and Finney tells him that Jean is training for the Olympics. Lidsberry tells them to remember that all athletic training should be dedicated to preparation for war, but Finney flatly replies, no. This response flusters Lidsberry, who mutters something and leaves. Finney muses that the headmaster seems to believe sincerely in the reality of the war. He concludes that Lidsberry must be too thin to be let in on the hoax run by the fat old men. Jean feels a flash of pity for Lidsberry's fatal thinness, reflecting that he indeed seems to have always had a gullible side. By this point in the book, the reader recognizes the effect of Finney's fall on his relationship with Jean. Far from driving a wedge between them, the fall has instead resulted in a tightening of the strange bond between the two friends. He needs me, Jean says to himself, watching his friend hobble into the shower, a realization sufficient to drive away his thoughts of joining the army. Were he to enlist, Jean would join Brinker Hadley in embracing adulthood and responsibility. In many ways, by staying by Finney's side, Jean inhibits his own development and process of self-discovery. There are two possible explanations for how the fall could have brought the friends closer, even though the events and emotions leading up to it seem to prove Jean undeserving of such a friendship. First, Finney does seem to harbor a genuine love for Jean, and, because he loves his friend, it doesn't occur to him that Jean might not love him back. As usual, he assumes that other people approach the world in the same way that he does. This attitude emerges clearly in his comments about Winter. Loving Winter himself, he cannot conceive of the season harboring any enmity toward him, though Jean points out that Winter is treacherous for someone on crutches. If one loves something enough, he insists, it must return that affection. One can argue that this assumption that love is always reciprocated is the foundation of his continued closeness with Jean. But there may be a darker current underpinning the boy's closeness, working alongside Finney's innocent love for his best friend. We have already seen evidence of Gene's eagerness to lose himself and Finney, to give up his identity and live as a part of his friend. But now, in Finney's enthusiasm to train Gene for the 1944 Olympics, we observe how Finney, too, contributes to this process, welcoming this sacrifice on Gene's part. Denied the ability to live life to the fullest by his injury, Finney sets out to live through Gene by attempting to transform him into the athlete that he himself once was. When Gene achieves his breakthrough on the track and becomes a better runner, Finney remarks that Gene has learned something new about himself through exercise. While this statement may be true, it also rings of cruel irony. Perhaps all that Gene has learned about himself is how easily he can transform himself into a mirror of Finney.